wanted to escape all her life. She couldn't leave until 1994, because in 1993 I decided to change my religion, and I became a Christian basically, and rescued her in 1994, brought her back to her country, and she is with her mother, back to her family. And it's really her story that needs to be told. Because the question I always ask is, whenever do you hear a story of a Muslim girl falling in love with a non-Muslim boy, a Hindu or a Christian or a Jew, and being allowed to marry this guy? It's always the case of a Muslim male marrying a non-Muslim female or a Christian girl, and you never hear the vice versa of the story. I've very rarely ever heard of such a story of a Muslim girl marrying a Christian boy. It happens maybe on occasion, but the majority of the stories is always that a Muslim can have the right to marry a non-Muslim girl. Of course, living in the Middle East, going to Friday prayers, going to the Temple Mount, listening to sermons by Ikrimah Sabri, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Even the Wailing Wall doesn't belong to the Jewish people. I went to school all my life in Dar Jasser in Bethlehem. And in Dar Jasser school, I was right adjacent to Rachel's tomb. Never knew who Rachel was all my life there. Who was Rachel? Qabr Rahil. Didn't understand who Rachel was. Didn't understand the history of Jerusalem or the connectivity of the Jewish people to that land. Of course, from listening to all the sermons, religious education, social studies, historical studies, we were the original Canaanites. We had the presence in this land way before the Jewish presence, because we wanted the connectivity to the presence to this land way before the Jewish existence or the Joshuan conquest. So we were the Canaanites. You can hear Yasser Arafat, Faisal Husseini, all the prominent figures of the Palestinians saying that we were the original Jebusites and we were the Canaanites. I began to ask myself a question in 1993 as I read the Bible, because Canaan was the son of Ham. How could Canaan be a Hamite? And we consider ourselves Arabs, of course, Arabs from Abraham. How could we be Canaanites and Hamitic origin and also a Semitic origin at the same time? Of course, I began as a youth as a graffitist. I began to write graffiti on the walls. I began to entice other kids to go on demonstrations against Israel. The idea of destroying Israel have never left our mind in school. Of course, the Israel education system didn't allow an Israeli system to enter into our school. We had our education curricula coming from the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, and it didn't have any of the open kind of a critical thinking that you enjoy here in the West, to think critically or to ask questions. In the Middle East, all my life I lived there, there's usually one party line or the coffin. I mean, you could be pro-PFLP, Popular Front to Liberate Palestine, you could be pro-PLO, you could be pro-Hamas, but one thing we were all pro is that we had the idea that Israel must be wiped out and we must establish a state. In fact, I always ask myself the question, prior to 1967, the Palestinian Charter never even included the land that we call Judea, the West Bank. It was never included part of that charter. What happened? I mean, after all, we wanted to establish a state in Palestine, yet it seems like the secretary forgot to type Palestine and, in that land we call Judea, biblical Judea, as that state. Because we were proud Jordanians. I was considered a Jordanian. My father served in the Jordanian army. We saluted King Hussein in going to theater or go to school. We had the Jordanian national anthem. We were all Jordanians. And all of a sudden, after the 6-Day War, the charter was changed, and now Palestine is to be established in that land called Judea. Well, Palestine was supposed to be established in Israel proper, where the Jews were. It took me years to realize why. Well, it's because the idea of establishing a Palestinian state when King Hussein ruled it was an anathema. He's an Arab ruling Arab country, and Gaza was ruled by Jamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt. So Gaza was considered Egypt. There was no problem with us being ruled by other Arabs. The idea was to be, rejection of being ruled by a Zionist or a Jewish entity. But I never considered racism as part of our life. Because even asking my family at the family reunion in San Francisco, I had my uncle, my aunts, my cousins. Everybody was there, their children, their children's children. We were all having a family reunion. And I was asking questions, I'm living in America here. How was life for you back in Palestine? Now you have Yasser Arafat. You're supposed to be happy. You have somewhat of a state now. How was life for you back in the Palestinian areas? Well, my uncle says life is miserable. I says, why is it miserable? He began to tell me how Yasser Arafat and the PA really abused people, had a monopoly over businesses, territorial monopolies. The PLO was very dictatorial. I said, well, how was your life in comparison with your life under the Israeli occupation? I remember what they said. They said, well, under the occupation, those were the good old days. I said, excuse me, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. What do you mean the good old days? Those were the good old days. Life was good. There was tourism. There was money to be made. Education. Everything was good at those times. Now it's really, really miserable. I said, why don't you speak out? And my uncle says, that's a stupid question. I said, why is it a stupid question? He says, you know very well, Walid, that we will never accept the Jews to rule over us. I said, excuse me? Then the issue is not an issue of a state or land. It's racism. I began to understand racism. One Palestinian was asked the question, if all the Jews converted to Islam, will we still have an Arab-Israeli war? And the answer was, of course no. But then the question is, it's not an issue of land, is it? It's an issue of Jews ruling over land that was waqf at one point in time. It was a waqf territory. It belonged to Islam because Umar ibn al-Khattab had occupied it at one point. It is a Muslim land. In fact, historically speaking, I began to realize after I began to study history for a change that the Arabs, and those are the best historians you can find, the Arabs ruled that land you call Judea less than 100 years. Less than 100 years the Arabs ruled Judea, that land. All of it was Mamluks, it was the Ottomans, it was the Romans, it was the Crusades. So it was so why not establish an Ottoman state or a Crusader state or a Roman state? Why an Arab Palestinian Muslim state? And this has been my argument from a long time ago, that this idea of creating the state called Palestine is going to end up not a mini America, but it's going to end up as a mini Iran. In fact, I was on Fox News one time and I was sitting there and I had a discussion with one of the Fox News teams over this issue. And he says, for your information, I always supported a Palestinian state. What's the name of that guy on Fox News? Big mustache. Somebody can... Geraldo Rivera, yes. Well, he says, what are you in for? He says, I'm a Palestinian. I came to have an interview with Bill O'Reilly. And he says, you're Palestinian? I said, yes, I'm Palestinian. He says, for your information, I always have supported the Palestinian state. I said, excuse me, you're talking to the only person who doesn't support the Palestinian state. I said, Mr. Rivera, I'd be glad to make a bet with you. This was before the Hamas election, before the elections, before even Hamas even came to power in Gaza, before... I said, I have a bet to make with you. I said, it's going to be an election there, and we're going to have a Hamasistan. It's going to be an Islamist state. It's going to be a very oppressive state. There'll be no rights for women, no freedom of speech. I'm willing to make a bet with you for $1 million that Hamas will be victorious before the elections. And would you make that bet with me? He said, of course not. I said, why? It seems, Mr. Rivera, you know the facts already. And you look at the news, you look at everything that's happening, the facts are so clear what has evolved as a result of that state. But there's nobody in this politically correct world that could stand up with some guts to say what we have now is not a state, but what we have now is indeed a state of psychosis. It's a state of psychosis in which you see two Jews getting lost in Ramallah, and they being lynched, thrown out the window, which is really, if you think about it, it happens in every culture. I mean, people kill people in every culture. Okay, well, somebody's going to object and says, Walid, murders happen all the time. But the difference between our culture and your culture is that in your culture, if such event happened, you don't have the entire men of Ramallah standing there in the middle of the square in Ramallah on photo, in film, praising as loud as they can, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. You don't have this kind of culture here where you see body parts and internals and intestines in a platter in which the children are coming and carrying pieces of the body parts, praising Allah in a euphoric fashion. That doesn't exist in this culture, but it exists in mine. I mean, after Israel left, and nobody wants to have the guts to say it, my country has become the night of the living dead, literally. Not allegoric, literal. People, bodies being dragged in the streets of Bethlehem and Ramallah and everywhere. People being lynched upside down for their support to Israel. In fact, I have 5 minutes to live right now if I decided to go back to my country. 5 minutes. Why? Because I simply changed my religion. I simply stopped believing that Allah is God and Muhammad is the Prophet of Allah. I am a kafir. As a kafir, I must die. In fact, I remember when I began to express my views to my family, I got a phone call. We always get a phone call. I got a phone call from my brother. He says, I talked to your uncle back home. You have no more land. Your land is gone. Confiscated. I said, by what right? I have the deed to my land. I purchased it with my own money. He says, you've changed your religion. If you want your land back, you must go back to Bethlehem court, Sharia law, and declare the Shahadatan. Go back to Islam, or else you will lose all your land. So I had a follow-up question and answer time. I said, then the Jews didn't steal my land? All my life, the Jews stole our land? All my life, I knew very well that Tahir al-Husseini sold land to the Jewish National Fund. My grandfather sold land to the Jewish National Fund. The Supreme Muslim Council sold land to the Jewish National Fund. Yasser Arafat's uncle sold land to the Jewish National Fund. My grandfather was going to be executed for selling land to the Jewish National Fund by Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, the leader of the Palestinian Revolution, for selling land to Jews. Way before the establishment of the State of Israel. The Jews didn't steal my land. You stole my land. I began to realize that in my culture, you can't change your mind. I changed my mind and I want to speak at a university. And the Muslim Student Association went up in arms. Why? In Michigan, the Muslim Student Association issued edicts, leaflets outside, how I'm such a false guy, how I'm made up, I'm a Zionist conspirator, I'm a lying, fabricating liar. In fact, they said even the mentor of Walid Shu'aibat, I was mentored in the United States of America by Jamal Saeed. I don't know how many of you know Jamal Saeed. He's been said to be a colleague of Abdullah Azzam, the mentor of Osama bin Laden, who's free in Chicago right now. He's free. Bridgeview Mosque raised funds for Hamas. I have him on video. All the truth is the truth. And they said, there is no Jamal Saeed, it doesn't even exist. I said, if you get your spelling correct, it's Jamalsaid, Saeed, not Sayed. You would Google the name and you'd find out for yourselves. Till today, they haven't even issued an apology for their mistakes. I don't know what to say. Basically, in 1993, I began, 1991 actually, 1991, something began to change about my life. I took a trip to Israel. I wanted to visit home. Here I was a Muslim sitting in the plane, and next to me was a Jewish lady. I didn't want her to even know that I was a Palestinian.